So this exhibition is about not just the artists that the Santa Fe Railroad and Fred Harvey Company worked with. It's about a much bigger picture than just paintings. At the turn of the 20th century, the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company were working with artists to market their products. And their immediate goal was to sell train tickets to Los Angeles. Los Angeles was putting out the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce was putting out a big push to draw settlers to Los Angeles, and Santa Fe played a large role in that effort. And the Fred Harvey Company, of course, was selling meals and hotel rooms. But they were also selling mystery and beautiful landscapes and exotic cultures that were unfamiliar to most people who lived, east of the Mississippi, certainly, or anywhere else in the world. They didn't initiate, but they contributed to and built on a romantic image of the West and the Southwest that had been developing since the middle of the 19th century. I mean, speaking for myself and probably for you, I would have to say that those efforts by the railroad and the Fred Harvey Company are a large part of the reason I'm here. I mean, since I was a kid, I've been absorbing this story and those images, and we're not even talking about architecture. I mean, architecture is such a big part of the story too, isn't it? By 1887, the Santa Fe Railroad had made it possible to travel by train from the Midwest to the West Coast, and their initial efforts were really more focused on freight. But this story is really more about people. And so I've got a few ads that I have interspersed throughout the talk, so you can enjoy these also. The question is, how many other major corporations in, say, 1905, 1910, were using fine art in their advertising? Probably not very many. So our story begins with Thomas Moran. So Thomas Moran, of course, went from basically a local or regional artist working in Philadelphia to literally an overnight sensation, not with this painting, but with this painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River that he did in 1872. He went from, like I say, being a regional artist to being a nationally known artist, and he became essentially a millionaire. And he repeated that performance when he produced this painting of the Grand Canyon in 1873 and 74. So he was definitely somebody who was well known on a national scale and was an obvious choice for the Santa Fe Railroad to turn to when they started thinking about art. So in 1892, a fellow named Charles Higgins, who was the director of advertising at the railroad at that time, invited Thomas Moran out to the Grand Canyon, which he hadn't been to since his time with John Wesley Powell in 1872. Moran, along with his photographer friend, William Henry Jackson, who he had met on the Hayden expedition to Yellowstone, were invited by the railroad to visit the Grand Canyon and spend some time. And they stayed out with John Hance out near Grandview, out in the eastern part of the canyon. And I don't think they actually went down to the river, but they did do a mule trip down into the canyon with Hance. And Moran did a number of sketches and watercolor paintings. And this is the large painting that resulted from that trip. Now, the railroad didn't purchase this particular painting, as we'll see with, as was more common in the future, but just to kind of put a starting point on all of this. And you can see that this particular painting is currently in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So the painting was used, though, to produce promotional materials. And so basically, just to kind of put an envelope over everything, you can pretty much assume that any work of art that I'm going to show you was used for multiple purposes and ranging from maybe wall calendars to travel posters to black and white line reproductions in magazines or newspapers. So a painting like this could be turned into a reproduction like this one, which is a chromolithograph, simply meaning colored lithographic print, that the railroad would would put in their offices, in the offices of travel agents, purposes like that. And if you like such things, this comes up for sale pretty regularly, maybe once or twice a year on eBay. There are a couple of rare print dealers who sell this pretty regularly also. They're not usually in very great condition, but they are out there. So a little background. Now, the Santa Fe Railroad didn't invent this idea. And the idea developed somewhat organically in the earlier 19th century in the Hudson River Valley of New York. When artists like Thomas Cole and his friends, the group known as the Hudson River School, would initially, for their own purposes, travel up the Hudson River and paint in the Catskills and the Adirondacks. And this coincided with the development of the first railroads and the first steamship service up the Hudson River. Again, carrying not only freight and mail and such things, but also ultimately providing passage for visitors, for travelers and tourists from New Jersey and New York City to get out of the urban, environment and out into nature. And so this is really the beginning of what today we would call landscape tourism. And Cole and his friends were at the heart of that initiative because, as we'll see with the Santa Fe and Fred Harvey Company, steamship companies and railroads would purchase paintings and same thing, use them for timetables and posters and calendars and etc. And it was also these artists who really, it's not a stretch to say, educated Americans on how to appreciate landscape and nature. And the Hudson River School is closely allied conceptually with the transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So the seeds are actually sown in New York State. So Thomas Moran actually worked his way into some advertisements. And this is just one example. There are a few other examples. And I'm going to show you a publication called Titan of Chasms that we have an example of in the exhibition. And in a few editions of Titan of Chasms, Moran also wrote basically on the appreciation of scenery. You know the Fred Harvey story? It's fairly miraculous. He's kind of a classic example of the American dream come true. He came from England when he was a young boy, worked as a dishwasher, learned the restaurant trade, and by the time he was in his 20s, he took over a lunch counter in a Santa Fe Railroad station in Topeka. And a couple of years later, he established the first official Harvey House restaurant and hotel in Florence, Kansas, which you see here. And that very humble, classic-looking building became the first of many, many such establishments. And it's important to remember, too, that before Fred Harvey, if you're traveling by train, there wasn't meal service on the train, and you either brought your own food or you got whatever questionable quality might be available at the stops. And there weren't restaurants at the stops. There basically would have been vendors selling who knows what. But the Fred Harvey Company went on to become the first national chain of restaurants and hotels. And here's another map showing the Fred Harvey route. And of course the administrators at the Santa Fe Railroad would have been, very happy that they had found this fellow who worked really hard, insisted on quality and fine service. So not only did he set up lunch counters, but the lunch counters used china and linen and silver, not just ordinary everyday crockery. In 1902, they built their largest, and it was actually the Santa Fe Railroad building the hotels. The Fred Harvey Company just ran them. The Santa Fe Railroad built the largest hotel for the Fred Harvey Company to date. It was the Alvarado Hotel in Albuquerque. And you can't see it in this photograph, but this is where, and it's worth noting that Charles Whittlesey, who designed the Alvarado, also designed El Tovar and the Reardon Mansion here in Flagstaff. So not in this photo is a large cavernous building called the Indian Building, right next door. And the Indian Building was a very elaborate curio shop, craft shop, art gallery, cultural experience. The bulk of the space was dedicated to exhibits on pottery and textiles and jewelry, and there were native artists demonstrating their crafts in the galleries. And then, I mean, it's almost a weary punchline, but how did people exit the Indian Building? Through the gift shop. So this could be the first example of the gift shop being strategically located so that you had to go through it on your exit from the Indian Building. So the strategy here was really quite profound, and again, probably a pioneering effort in that the Fred Harvey Company wasn't really interested in, they weren't interested in the idealistic virtues of education, but they wanted to educate their buyers. They wanted people to go through the exhibits and see pottery from the various New Mexico pueblos and say, oh, hey, I like these Acoma pots, or I like these San Ildefonso pots. I like these black pots by Maria from San Ildefonso. So you could go through, see examples of the wide range of things being made by native people so that you'd get all fired up, and by the time you got to the gift shop, you not only knew what you kind of were interested in, but you did have a context to put it in, and you're excited. It's brilliant. I mean, this whole story is so brilliant. And an hour is hardly enough time to really cover it, as the exhibit is barely enough to really cover the whole story. So absolutely brilliant strategy, I think. And the Fred Harvey Company continued to use native artists as demonstrators throughout many of their properties in the West. And when Hopi House opened in 1905, the potter Nampeo was the first native artist to take up residence in the third-floor apartment there. And she would do demonstrations of pottery making outside Hopi House. So like I said, their goals weren't idealistic. They wanted to sell pottery and jewelry and textiles. But they approached it from the education perspective. And in addition to the demonstrators and the Indian Building, they published a series of books. Here are some examples, some of which are still sold in gift shops at the South Rim today. So again, the idea was to get people interested in and excited about things presented in the books so that when they were visiting, they were ready to spend. And the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railroad weren't the first in the Southwest. So the craze, and it really was a craze, the interest in the Southwest, it began building really in the 1880s. And it grew tremendously in the 1890s with publications by a fellow named Charles Loomis. So this is just one, and that's not the original cover, but it is an illustration from the book, The Land of Poco Tiempo. Loomis also wrote a book, so he walked across the United States, and he wrote a book about that called The Tramp Across the Continent. He wrote another book called A New Mexico David and Other Stories and Sketches of the Southwest. And when he moved to Los Angeles in the 1890s, he started a magazine called Out West, which if you've never explored Out West, it's a wonderful publication. And again, just very much within this kind of, this milieu, this kind of building energy and interest in the Southwest. Here's another illustration from the land of Poco Tiempo. So some of the illustrations we'll see, if you look at this, I mean, a big part of the story is how stereotypical depictions of Native Americans became the norm. And really not just the norm, but they became the image of the Southwest that really persists till to today. And this is a wonderful example. And not that it's not based on truth or reality, but you recognize these folks? Yeah, Harold's taking an apple, Mary's working. So, like the rest of the country, Harold Colton and Mary Russell Farrell Colton were caught up in the craze of the Southwest. They both traveled in the Southwest before their wedding in May of 1912, but in preparation for their honeymoon, which they took throughout the West, beginning in New Mexico, they read Loomis's books and, like everybody else, got charged up about visiting New Mexico. And here's one more camp picture I put in just because I love it. I mean, camping hasn't changed a whole lot, has it? It's changed a little bit, but it hasn't changed a whole lot. So they arrived in New Mexico starry-eyed. So one of the great programs, one of the great products developed by the Fred Harvey Company was called the Indian Detours that premiered in 1926. So the Indian Detours were a deluxe set of tours that you could take with a guide and a driver. The guides were cute young women they called couriers. Professional driver who usually wore a very large 10-gallon type hat. And the Indian Detours visited various pueblos in New Mexico, and also Canyon de Chelly and kind of the eastern portion of the Navajo Reservation. And depending on the year, so think of Rhodes Scholar, think of National Geographic, think of other similar contemporary tour companies. That's what this is. So each year they had kind of a set number of standard tours that they would do. So when there were tours, there were 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, et cetera, et cetera. And each season they would kind of mix them up, as tour companies do. Oh, so we talked about stereotypical imagery. Have you spotted the gaffe in the photograph? Yeah, so for some reason, and the artists succumbed to it too. And Native Americans, of course, were immensely impacted by the traffic on the Santa Fe once it was completed through the Southwest. It was a massive geographic intrusion that brought thousands of people a year through their homelands. And it was kind of a mixed blessing. So it was clearly, a social and personal intrusion, but it also offered Native artists a great audience for their work in an economy that, was still really a barter economy in many of the Pueblo villages. So the arrival of the Indian Detours, the arrival of the Santa Fe Railroad, gave Native artists an immense new audience for their work. Initially, when the train first came through, artists would sell their wares to the tourists right from the train platform. And then the Fred Harvey Company began adding gift shops to the lunchrooms and the hotels, eventually, again, building the Indian Building in 1902 in Albuquerque. And many painters, such as Fred Cabote, here at work on one of the murals in the Watchtower, did sell easel works to the Santa Fe Railroad, and we've got a few examples in the exhibition. So it was very much a mixed bag for Native residents. So here's a photo. I love this photo, and there's actually oh God, what's it? Do you all know who John Sloan, the New York artist, was? John Sloan did a wonderful etching of, it's actually a dance at one of the pueblos with a bunch of these big Harvey touring cars pulled up around the dance scene and poking fun at the white tourists. But anyway, isn't this a wonderful photo if you've never seen it before? So you can see, she's kind of hidden, but you can see the courier sitting on the running board here. And you can see the driver. So an example of Native artists selling their work directly to the visitors here. And in one of the books about the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company and this effort, there are interviews with some Native residents from some of the pueblos in New Mexico. And just to paraphrase one, the woman said that, yes, it was a great thing because it brought cash into our local economy. But on many occasions, the visitors would wander around the village poking their heads in through windows and doors of private homes. So the Santa Fe Railroad built a very large art collection from the work they commissioned from artists. At one point, it numbered more than 600 paintings. Somewhat ironically, the first painting purchased for the purpose of building a collection for the corporation and for use for marketing purposes was this painting of the San Francisco Peaks by Bertha Dressler, done in 1900. So I say ironically because when you think Southwest, the San Francisco Peaks are lovely and they're our home, but they're not the landscape that probably first pops in your mind, are they? And while women artists were beginning to slowly make inroads into the art market and the art scene, it always surprised me that a lesser-known woman artist was the first artist who sold a painting to the Santa Fe. And we have a reproduction of this painting in the exhibition. If you've seen the exhibit, you saw it on a plate that was given to railroad employees as a commemorative gift for some event or another. And here's another painting by Bertha of the Grand Canyon. In 1903, Louis Aiken, a young artist from Portland, Oregon, was in New York City trying to make a living as an illustrator and fine artist. Aiken was contacted by the railroad to visit the Hopi villages and do some paintings of Hopi Indians, quote unquote. I don't like the quote thing usually, but sometimes you have to do it. Do some paintings of Hopi Indians for promotional purposes. So this is very early in the effort, and Aiken, of course, jumped at the opportunity, went to the Hopi villages, and wound up living there for a few years, becoming close friends with some of the residents. And this is one of the paintings that he did. And after he left Hopi, he moved down to Flagstaff. And in 1906, he received a commission to do a painting of the El Tovar Hotel. And of much of what I'm going to show you, this is one of my favorite paintings and favorite examples of the effort we're talking about. So do you notice anything quirky about this depiction of the El Tovar? Yeah, the canyon isn't quite this precipitous in this part of the rim. And of course, Hopi House isn't right on the edge, isn't it? Yeah, so he did take a little artistic license there. And you'll notice on the rim trail, there's an Anglo rider approaching us on a horse, and then a couple of Hopi women walking away from us, presumably towards Hopi House. So I don't know why Lewis included them aside from just local color and cultural connections. But I like to think, my interpretation, is the Anglo rider riding towards us is the future. And the Native Americans walking away from us represent the past. And if you can bring to mind Thomas Moran's painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, can some of you visualize that? So there are two figures in that painting. One is Ferdinand Hayden, and one is a Native American. The Native American is looking back over his shoulder while Hayden points towards the canyon, again, as if pointing towards the future. And again, I don't know what Thomas Moran, was intending with those gestures, but what I love about this aren't those factors. What I love about it is the Santa Fe made a reproduction of the painting and then sold it. So that's directly akin to wearing a T-shirt that says Calvin Klein, or a handbag that has Gucci logos all over it, or any type of branded merchandise. So they're able to sell their advertising. And I've always thought you can't do much better than that. So here's another Louis Aiken painting just to enjoy, one done down by the Colorado River called Christmas Morning. Aren't those yuccas great? So here he is himself, Thomas Moran, with Elliot Dangerfield and Edward Pothast and DeWitt Parshall. So I think one of the most publicized events tied into this whole effort was a trip sponsored for these 5 artists by the Santa Fe Railroad and Fred Harvey Company in 1910, where they brought 5 of the best-known artists in the East Coast at that time out to the Grand Canyon. And they got the press involved. There were, big stories about it. There were photographs in all the major newspapers about these, 5, great contemporary artists visiting the Grand Canyon. So I have examples from a few of them. We've already seen Thomas Moran, of course. This is an absolutely stunning, I think, Edward Potthast painting of the canyon. Not only is it a fantastic painting of the canyon, but if you're not familiar with Edward Potthast, his stock and trade paintings were depictions of people at the beach. Kids, adults, kind of out on the Long Island beaches, outside New York City. Completely unlike this, both in terms of subject matter and style. Elliot Dangerfield. So one of the interesting things about Elliot Dangerfield is who had a bit more of a more mystical kind of approach to his art. He was one of Mary Russell Farrell Colton's teachers and mentors when she was a student in Philadelphia. And sometimes his things got a little out of hand. So one of my favorite artists from this set is William Robinson Lay, who was extremely popular at the time. And if you're not familiar with Lay, you might be familiar with some of the work he did at the Museum of Natural History in New York City. He painted, I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was 4 or 5 or 6 of the dioramas for the natural history dioramas, which are still in use today. So a great story about him is in 1907, he spent a month camped below the rim out over Hermit Canyon. So if you go to Hermit's Rest, the next point to the west is called Yuma Point. Below Yuma Point, on what's called the Boucher Trail, is Columbus Point. So he camped there for a month and did, I don't know how many small oil studies like this. And in, I think it was 1911, he wrote a fabulous article for Charles Loomis's Out West magazine. Long story. And he talks about his experiences for that month. He basically takes you through a whole day as he would spend it. So he talks about painting the morning light, and he talks about painting the afternoon. There's a great quote where he talks about it getting so hot that he has to constantly worry about keeping his palette level so the paint, which is becoming loose, doesn't slide off the palette. He also talks about painting by moonlight at night. And one of the copies of Titan of Chasms in the exhibition features a painting on the cover by Lay. So Titan of Chasms, I don't think it was refreshed annually, but there were a number of editions of it. And each edition had a different work of art, basically the same contents. And the contents were essentially what to do at the Grand Canyon. And just like such things today, if you've got half a day, do this. If you have a whole day, do these things. If you have 2 days, and et cetera, et cetera. Each edition did have a story about geology, written by John Wesley Powell. And I mentioned that some of them have an essay by Thomas Moran on the appreciation of scenery. This is one of my favorite paintings of the Grand Canyon. Have any of you seen this before? So Oscar Burninghouse was affiliated with the Taos Society of Artists, who were very well represented in the Santa Fe collection and promotional materials. What does this tell you about the Grand Canyon? What kind of an experience are these visitors having? And they are well dressed, aren't they? Yeah, this isn't Joe the plumber from New Jersey. Well, so much of the art that we're looking at, in fact, this whole endeavor, is really a reflection of the Romantic movement. And one of the key elements of the Romantic movement is exotic people. We've already seen some exotic people. We're going to see some more exotic people, right? But a big part of the Romantic movement, and something that visual artists excuse me, and musicians tried to capture in their work, is the idea of the sublime. That is an experience of beauty that's so profound that it feels threatening or even dangerous. And the audience for this painting would have known that because they were programmed by the Hudson River School artists. So we have well-dressed people who are clearly comfortable and enjoying their visit to the rim of the canyon in the face of a coming thunderstorm. And if you've ever been on, has anybody ever been on the rim during a thunderstorm? And you took care to be conscious and safe about it? Well, that's a sublime experience. That's a sublime experience. And that's what these people are having. So what can you have if you take the Santa Fe Railroad to the Grand Canyon? You can actually have a sublime experience, which music and paintings can never capture, because it's not about the physical nature. It's about the unwritten, the unknown. It's about the pure primal experience. Walter Ufer is another Tao Society of Artists member who did a number of works for the railroad. Here's one of the canyon. It's oddly green, isn't it? I've always wondered about this painting. So one of his paintings, Taoist Girls, if you've seen the exhibit, this painting has appeared on the wall calendar in the exhibition. Founding member of the Tao Society of Artists, Ernest Blumenschein, did this really beautiful, colorful painting of a fellow from Taos holding a pot. You know, and it's kind of funny, you know, looking at depictions of Native Americans in this way today, you know, from our perspective. It's a fantastic painting. I mean, it's beautiful. The brushwork is just as good as it gets. And there's something just not right about it. I wasn't even thinking about the headdress. I was just thinking about the commodification of this fellow. But yeah, that's not a Taoist headdress, I don't think. But it's a fantastic painting. So Mr. Kaus, E.I. Kaus, Eanger Irving Kaus. So I only put one in because Kaus was probably the most favored artist of William Simpson, the fellow who took over after Charles Higgins actually died at an early age. Kaus was clearly, I think, Simpson's favorite because Kaus wound up on 20 some odd calendar covers, far more than any other single artist. And he has a very distinctive style, and most look very much like this particular painting. You know, there's a great photograph of Kaus standing at the door to his home in Taos with two of his models. So there are two fellows, this being one of them. I can't remember their names off the top of my head, but there are two models he worked with primarily who show up in 99% of his paintings. And basically in different postures, you know, in this case crouching by a fireplace. And Kaus had a room in his studio that was filled with artifacts that he would use for props, including pottery from various Pueblo villages, headdresses from all over the United States, other items of clothing and weapons, again, from all over the United States. And it's important, and I just thought of this as I was saying this, it's important to recognize too that, you know, he wasn't the first one to do that. Blumenschein wasn't the first one to do it. John Wesley Powell wasn't the first one to do it. You know, John Wesley Powell had a huge collection of Native American artifacts, and when they were working up around Kanab, he would have Jack Hillers, the photographer, dress Southern Paiute people in Plains or Eastern Woodlands headdresses, holding drums or shields from the Plains or the East. So it was common practice, you know, and it was ignorance of cultural identity. So a couple of Gunnar Woodforce paintings for you. In 1925, Gunnar did this aerial painting of the Grand Canyon, and I'm trying to remember. I think it was either 24, maybe the same year, 25. He did a similar aerial map of Yosemite Valley and National Park for Yosemite. So he did fly in a plane once. He flew in the Ford Trimotor up to Kanab with a couple of Park Service guys. So he had the opportunity to see the canyon from the air, but that was the year after this was painted. So he did this from his, well, I can't say magic, he did it from his mind's eye. And you can see that it's pretty darned accurate. I mean, it's very generalized, but it's pretty darned accurate. So so you can see the folds. Can you see the folds in it? So this is actually the reproduction after the text was added and all the other map elements. This was the center folds, the center spread in a brochure called Grand Canyon Outings, which we have an example of in the exhibition also. It's not opened up to the map, unfortunately, but you can see the cover. And this was used from 1926 well into the later 30s for that brochure called Grand Canyon Outings. Gunnar did 6 paintings for the Santa Fe Railroad. This is the first one. He had a commission to do Phantom Ranch, which was still new in 1925. The first phase of construction was started in 1922. Now, if you've been to Phantom Ranch, what can you tell me about this painting? Yes, what about the cottonwood trees, Jerry? You can see they're just youngsters here. Yeah, so this is a great historical document of Phantom Ranch from a little ways up Bright Angel Creek. Yeah, today these cottonwood trees are 3 times this size, maybe 4 times. They're absolutely gigantic. And that's what makes Phantom such an oasis in the summertime. So this painting, actually, William Simpson actually hung this painting in his office. And then here's another one that he did a couple years later. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company engaged in much more than simply hiring artists to create beautiful paintings for advertising purposes. So let's head over to California and take a look at what was taking place over there at the turn of the century. There was an interesting development, literary and artistically and architecturally, known as the Spanish fantasy past. And the book Ramona by Helen Hunt Jackson and Zorro are 2 examples of this. Both characters began as serialized fictional pieces in magazines that then eventually became full-fledged novels. Ramona was stupendously popular. And think of some current cultural rage, and that was Ramona in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The first movie made of Ramona was in 1910, and 4 other movies followed between 1910 and the 1950s. And of course, Zorro is still being produced today. I'm sure there's another one waiting to be made. So this Spanish fantasy past was a really fascinating kind of phenomena based on the myths associated with and stereotypes associated with the Spanish colonial period in the Southwest and Greater West. So we see this expressed in two international expositions presented in California in 1915. In San Francisco, the Panama Pacific Exposition, and you can see from this aerial view, it was an immense fairground with all manner of exhibitions, including a room set up with demonstrators brought in by the Fred Harvey Company, sponsored and brought in by the Fred Harvey Company. And then, of all things, a model Grand Canyon exhibition that through which you could actually ride a small train and view the painted diorama. Ironically, in San Diego, there was another exposition being put on at exactly the same time. The San Diego Chamber of Commerce actually came up with the idea to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal with an international exposition, since San Diego was the first harbor in the United States north of the Panama Canal. Well, when San Francisco got word of this and the federal government heard about it, San Franciscans thought that they would be a better venue for a large international exposition, and the federal government agreed with the San Franciscans. So San Francisco received a lot of resources and a lot of publicity. Although in San Diego, the Chamber of Commerce decided to go ahead regardless and present their own exposition called the Panama, California exposition. And you can see in this poster for the San Diego exposition characters associated with the Spanish fantasy past and stereotypes of what we tend to think of, colonial era California. You've got the friar, you've got a Mexican with a sombrero, and a Native American with his blanket and pottery on the right side there. Looking out on a scene of the fairground area in San Diego with the Cabrillo Bridge and the tower at what's now called the Museum of Man in Balboa Park. So Balboa Park was the location. And a number of, as you can see in this advertisement from the Santa Fe Railroad, which also mentions, by the way, that the World War in Europe would not affect the opening of the exposition or the interruption of service by the Santa Fe to San Diego for the exposition. So, as I started to say, a number of large exposition buildings were built, some of which were only temporary and later torn down, but some, like the Cabrillo Bridge and the Museum of Man with its distinctive tower, inspired by Spanish Baroque architecture in Spain. And notice in the lower portion of the ad, you can see a gondola on a lagoon below the large tower and the Cabrillo Bridge. So they actually did flood that valley or canyon. It's really more of a canyon that the Cabrillo Bridge crosses and through which today I-15 actually originates as it heads north towards Las Vegas. So they did flood this, and there were plans to actually have gondolas available for fairgoers to ride around in. But for some reason that I can't remember, the gondolas never actually were put in place. There were other boats though, but no Venetian gondolas. So here's a postcard of that very elegant bridge, and you can see the lake below it. That was called the lagoon. And then one of the fair buildings from the 1915 exposition that still remain is called the Casa del Prado, which is done in the Spanish Baroque style and still used in Balboa Park today. Another interesting building of entirely different style that we call Pueblo Revival style, which is pretty much the dominant style in present-day Santa Fe, is the New Mexico building. The New Mexico building was modeled as a smaller version of what is now the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe, which is a larger version of this version made for San Diego. And you can see it's done in a very traditional but somewhat modernized Pueblo type style. So what did the Santa Fe Railroad and the Fred Harvey Company get into in San Diego? Well, they brought in workers from New Mexico familiar with adobe building techniques, and they built a Pueblo village in Balboa Park, which is no longer there. So in this photograph, you can see the Pueblo village rising in the background with the workers brought in producing adobe blocks in the foreground. So there were actually Native American people who would live in the village and do demonstrations just as they were, in other Fred Harvey locations, demonstrating pottery making and jewelry making and weaving. So we'll come back to this in a minute. But interestingly enough, right next door in the fairgrounds to what was called the Painted Desert exhibition, the Pueblo Village, was another exhibit sponsored by International Harvester Company and the maker of agricultural equipment called the Model Farm. And the Model Farm that you can see in this aerial photo was meant to be an exhibition of modern day agricultural techniques. And then you can see this portion of it is an orchard with, you can see the smudge pots in there. Here's a map of the exposition grounds. I've always thought it really ironic or paradoxical or something along those lines that the model farm lay directly adjacent to the Pueblo village. So what we have are depictions of a village that would be affiliated in real life with very traditional farming techniques, practiced for 2,000 years in the desert Southwest, directly adjacent to the model farm portraying, the most modern techniques available, and not visible in the photo of the model farm, and just outside the photo to the right is a large field where International Harvester could demonstrate their agricultural equipment and implements. So kind of I don't know that there's anything political or judgmental intended here, but clearly there's the contrast of the ancient and the Native American culture in sharp contrast with modernism, with the modern approach to agriculture. So in the Pueblo village, as I mentioned, Native artists would do demonstrations, and in this photograph, Maria Martinez is demonstrating her pottery making techniques. And you can see with a few fellows looking on from the terrace up in this portion of the village. And of course, it wouldn't be a Native American exhibit without dances. And you can see a few visitors in the background sitting watching the performance here. So this isn't at all unusual because this was taking place, again, at other Fred Harvey locations, as in Albuquerque and outside Hopi House at Grand Canyon, primarily. But when you put this into a fair or international expositions type of setting, what we have are human beings put on exhibit. And so this is reminiscent of the exhibit that featured Native American people in the Great Parisian Exposition of, I think it was 1887. And then, of course, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 and 94, where there was a large exhibit devoted to Native American culture. So by today's standards, just a little politically incorrect, as we might say, but not really questioned in 1915. And of course, the fair was a great hit. Both of the fairs were great hits. They both had great visitation, and newspaper articles in San Diego, were very, very complimentary to the fair organizers and sponsors. And then here are just a couple of postcards from the San Diego exposition. On the left, a scene from the Painted Desert exhibit, and then again the beautiful Cabrillo Bridge on the right, again contrasting the ancient and the modern. And it's interesting to note, I realized when I was putting this postcard in here that, in fact, if you remember back to the photograph of the Pueblo village from the Indian Detour brochure, and the fellow who was wearing the Plains headdress, he was standing beside a very similar entrance to a kiva like we see in this postcard on the left. So I think one has to absolutely applaud the Fred Harvey Company and the Santa Fe Railroad for the effort they made to incorporate not just art, but cultural demonstrations and recreations in the case of, like the expositions and Hopi House and similar marketing devices from the early 20th century. Now today, I don't know what current visitation has been the last year or two, but let's just say that nearly 5 million people a year visit Grand Canyon, following the route, paved and promoted by the Santa Fe Railroad, and continuing to take photographs at viewpoints and Fred Harvey locations at the South Rim. Today we still struggle with stereotypical depictions of Native Americans. We still struggle with the wholesale stylization and commercial use of nature, of natural elements. And of course, tourism has a great environmental impact. It's often overlooked until it's presenting grave problems. Here in Flagstaff, we're a hub for tourism, and of course, and being being a border town with the Navajo and Hopi reservations, we certainly have to deal with stereotypical views of Native Americans. And despite the cultural and environmental challenges, as there so often is, there's much truth in the myths that the Fred Harvey Company and Santa Fe Railroad built upon. The American Southwest is an area of great natural beauty and mystery and rich indigenous cultures. And that's a large reason that many of us live here today. And of course, that's what still draws millions of visitors a year from around the world. And thank you very much for coming. Enjoy your afternoon.